All right, welcome everyone. Thank you all so much for coming out here tonight. My name is Julia. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm on the events team here at Books Are Magic. Before we jump into the conversation, I do just want to share a few brief logistics. First off, we do ask that you keep your masks on while at the event. Secondly, we are going to be doing a hand-raised Q&A towards the end of the conversation, so start thinking of your questions now and then hang on to them. After the talk tonight, Namwali is going to be personalizing books at the desk all the way at the back of the store, and we will have additional books available for purchase up at the register where you came in. And if you're joining us virtually on YouTube, saw a few of you waiting when we kicked off, we'd love to encourage you also to buy a copy of the Furrows online, and you can use the link in the live stream description to do so. Okay, with all of that out of the way, I'm so very excited tonight to introduce Namwali Serpell and Carmen Machado, who are here celebrating the release of Namwali's new book, The Furrows. So just a few brief words about the book. The Furrows follows a family in the wake of a devastating loss of their son Wayne, whose body is never recovered. The story centers on C, who has to reckon with the absence of her brother and the ripple effects it has on her entire family. The book is tagged as an elegy rather than just a novel, which I think captures perfectly both the poetic and evocative prose the Furrows is written in, as well as its intimate exploration of grief, memory, and the ways in which mourning shapes a person's life. This is a story that manages both to subvert expectations and move the reader deeply, and I, in particular, really love what the poet Tracy K. Smith had to say about the Furrows. She says, Namwali Serpell's riveting prose urges me to believe that sometimes the true work of grief is to rupture us so thoroughly we become capable of telling and living another story. Namwali Serpell was born in Lusaka, Zambia, and lives in New York. She received a 2020 Wyndham Campbell Literature Prize, the 2015 Caine Prize for African Writing, and a 2011 Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award. Her debut novel, The Old Drift, won the Anisfield Wolf Book Award, the Arthur C. Clarke Award for Science Fiction, and the Los Angeles Times Art Seidenbaum Award for First Fiction. She's currently a professor of English at Harvard. And as I mentioned, Namwali is joined in conversation tonight by the lovely Carmen Machado. Carmen is the author of the best-selling memoir In the Dream House and the award-winning short story collection Her Body and Other Parties. She has been a finalist for the National Book Award and the winner of the Bard Fiction Prize, the Lambda Literary Award for Lesbian Fiction, and the National Book Critics Circle's John Leonard Prize, among others. So that's enough for me. Without further ado, everyone please give a very warm welcome to Namwali and Carmen.
Thank you everyone for coming. It's so wonderful to see so many of my loved ones in one place. And thank you, Carmen, for doing this conversation. Carmen and I have been in conversation for many years now, but it's nice to actually broadcast that conversation to other people. I hope you find it interesting. It's like a podcast. So I'm going to read from the beginning of the novel, and therefore you need no context. I don't want to tell you what happened. I want to tell you how it felt. When I was 12, my little brother drowned. He was 7. I was with him. I swam him to shore. His arms were wrapped around my neck from behind, his chest on my back, his knees pummeling my thighs. At first, his small, heavy head was on my shoulder, and he breathed in my ear, the occasional snort when water came in. His head bounced. My shoulder ached. His hands were knotted at my collarbone, and I held them there with my hand, both so that he wouldn't let go and so that he wouldn't choke me. With my other hand, I pushed the water away. We had gone to the beach for the day, just the two of us, alone, together. This was allowed. This was our whole summer. Every morning, after breakfast and cartoons, my brother and I would leave our father to edit his articles and our mother to dab at her paintings. Wayne and I would change into our still damp swimsuits, and I would pack us Capri Suns and Lunchables from the fridge. We would walk along the roads, cutting through a gap between the fancier houses to reach the beach. My mother had told us that the gap was called No Man's Land, which Wayne misheard and took to mean it belonged to a man named Norman. We'd sneak quietly through Norman's land, then tromp over the boardwalk, our flip-flops knocking against it, and find our favorite spot on the shore, which was marked by clumps of seagrass. Wayne was a nutty brown, a scrawny creature, a good kid. He played so hard as if play were work. I was too old to play, so I watched him play and helped sometimes. That day, I buried him for fun's sake. We dug a shallow trench with cupped hands, like dogs, like gardeners. The top sand was cane sugar, the undersand brown sugar. When the trench was big enough, he tumbled into it, and I packed the sand onto his body, patting it over his hands and over his bony knees. Under the fluorescent sun, he lay still as a magician's assistant. He asked me to cover his head with our straw hat, and I said, "No, you'll suffocate." He flinched as if to grab for it himself, then remembered that his hand was buried. Too late. The mound of sand over it had sprouted a crack. He glanced at it, at me. I patted the sand back flat. After a moment, he said it again. He mouthed, "Cover my head." I touched my sandy finger to his sandy cheek. "Close your eyes, Wayne," I said, and placed the straw hat over his squinching face. Although our family had owned the straw hat for many years now, it was still too big for either of us kids to wear. We used it for carrying things instead, its leather chin strap serving as a handle. We had used it today to bring lunch and a towel. Now it swallowed his head completely. "You're a dead Mexican," I giggled. "Ole," he muffled from under the hat. I mean cowboy," I said. "Ahoy." "That's a sailor." There was a pause. "Yeehaw," he said. I didn't answer. I didn't laugh. I walked away from his buried body, staggered off into the sand pockets toward the greenish sea, bored, but deeply satisfied that he would be surprised to find me gone when he lifted that dumb hat off his face. My turn to trick him for once. My toes were already wet by the time he realized I was gone. He leapt up and tossed the hat and gangled his way toward me, yelling pell-mell, squamishing past me into the water. I watched his bronze back vanish, then retreated and sat beside the empty trench with my arms around my knees. There was no one else around. It was bright and hot, the end of summer. Then the clouds came and lowered. The wind rose. The waves rose. "Dear Wayne, you swam into the furrows. At first you didn't know it because you were under the surface, and you faced down as you swam, staring at the vault of the sea below. Then you felt the sky darken above you, a shadow passing. And when you came up to breathe, you were suddenly inside them, the great grooves in the water, the furrows. On either side of you, those whirring sheets of water rose, the foam along their edges sharpening like teeth. On either side of you, the furrows were chewing, cleaving deeper. They ate you up. You were alone out there, and the world took you back in, reclaimed you into its endless folding." He was joyful and swimming, and then he wasn't. I ran in. I swam to him. I reached him, and we grappled some until he managed to get on my back and wrap his arms around my neck. I held his knuckles in my hand. I turned and swam us to shore. He dragged me back. Halfway to the beach, his small, heavy head began to beat against my shoulder in an unreasonable way. That was the word I thought, unreasonable, a word our father would say. I knew to hold my breath and dive through the waves like our mother had taught us, but what about Wayne? Did he remember to dive, to hold his breath? There was no breath in me to ask or remind him. The wind whipped. I clutched his knuckles like a junk of bones in one hand, pushed the water away with the other. We rocked, his knees bumping the back of me, his head knocking my shoulder in that unreasonable way. It made no sound, but they found bruises later. I felt him soften, and something inside him came into me in little waves, more and more ripples until it was done, and my insides felt full up. His body swept clean of him, mine filled to bursting. I swam like this, doubled, an emptied sack on my back, my fingers raw with clutching.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful. So the first thing I want to talk about in regards to this novel is the subtitle, an elegy. And I was thinking a lot about the sort of the form of the elegy, and I wanted to ask, I mean, your relationship with genre between your first novel, The Old Drift, and this one is obviously wonderful and delicious and far-reaching. And so I wanted to ask, why an elegy? Like, why was that sort of the shape, and like, what does that shape mean to you in terms of this project?
Thank you. So there are many different ways to answer this question. The subtitle came late in the process when one of my trusted readers said to me, you know, it's funny, we have this ongoing argument where you think novels should have plots, and I don't think novels should have plots. And I wrote this novel, and it doesn't really have a plot. And, you know, he said, it's not really narrative, it's a poem. And the kind of poem that it is an elegy. And I started to think more about why that made a perfect kind of sense. My novel is very interested in repetition, and you can tell that from what I read. I considered stopping reading earlier, but then I thought, to get a sense of how often I bring back certain images as we move through the text, I think it would be better for me to go on. The idea of images coming back is the shape, for me, of memory, and it's also very much the shape of mourning. I was very interested in trying to enact a very particular rhythm of grief. The elegy is a form that I learned used to just be a description of a metrical pattern. It was like the sonnet, right? It could be about anything. And some of the earliest elegies were in fact love poems. And it only began to take on this connotation of being a poem about someone who you've lost, someone who's passed much later in its history. And so I liked the fact that this form also contained this aspect of just sheer repetition, but also that it had this secret history of longing, because as the novel proceeds, the intertwining of grief and eros becomes much more prominent.
Yeah, now I have like two separate thoughts, but I think this repetition, so one of the sort of features of the novel is the fact that Wayne's death is retold multiple times with completely different details. So we come to sort of understand it as this sort of shifting story that isn't fixed, which I guess is also like elegiac in that way. And I was thinking a lot about like Raymond Queneau's Exercises in Style, so this Olympian sort of project where you're moving between stories, telling it over and over with like different details, and the way it changes and the way that change sort of acclimates meaning. So can you talk about, I guess, the process of making these decisions to have this story of Wayne's death be sort of unfixed, or like have this sort of amalgamation, or this like like gestalt sort of effect, I think, that comes from like having these repeating stories.
Yeah, no, so there's this curious tension about repetition, in that it is both obviously about sameness, but it's also about difference, because when you repeat something, you're at a different point in time. And so I had lots of choices, actually. One of the things that's so funny to me about the way we talk about the death of the novel is like we've barely like touched all the things that a novel can do. There's so many forms of repetition historically that I could look to, and yet I could still try and do something interesting to me or new. So, you know, I could have tried for the kind of repetition in Bethel, or I could have tried for the kind of repetition in Gertrude Stein, or I could have tried for the kind of repetition in American Psycho or in Tom McCarthy's Remainder. There's so many different versions, and so just, you know, at a very basic level, I could have repeated the story of Wayne's disappearance on the beach over and over. Maybe the exact same language, maybe the language but slightly different. But I decided that what happens when you read an event a second time is you grow, as you said, acclimated to it. And I didn't want there to be a kind of numbing effect where, oh, now I'm revisiting this loss from a much more, analytic perspective. because I know I felt it maybe the first time, but this time I'm going to observe, what she's doing in language. I wanted there to be the same impact of shock and loss, and to reinscribe that. And while you're right, the details of how he gets lost are different. So in the second version, they're walking to school together, and the car hits him. The man in the car carries him to their home, and she goes in the house, and both the man and her brother disappear. In the third version, they're at the park. So the actual basic event is actually what changes, but the details, I actually kept some of them the same. I kept some of the same language, splumishing. It's very particular words sometimes that my editors were like, this is not a word. And I'd be like, yes, I want you to notice that. So that when you see it again, you realize I'm using it, right? So this kind of negotiation of similarity and difference for this structure, for me, I had to think about, do I want the reader to become numb to the event? To have what's called semantic evacuation, where if you hear the same word over and over again, it starts to not feel real. I'm like, no, I want it to feel real. The other main question for me, though, was how many times I was going to put the reader through what many readers have told me, especially parents, is very, very difficult scenes to read, where this kid is going to be killed or hurt in some fashion and is going to be lost. And I thought, well, if I do it twice, then people are going to wonder which of the two, did it happen this way or did it happen that way? If I do 3, then they'll know it's a repetition. If I do 4, they'll be bored. so I landed on 3.
This is not a question we actually talked about, but I'm suddenly thinking about the man in the windbreaker. So there's this mysterious figure who is holding her brother, carrying her brother, and it's just this open mystery about who this man is. And when she, there's this sort of detail like later in the novel where her father, when she's an adult, says to her like, I looked for this man but like never found him. And there's some doubt as to like, did he exist? Did she invent him? And I was thinking a lot about Shirley Jackson's The Tooth, or I guess just The Lottery in general, and like James Harris in that novel, this mysterious figure who sort of appears, and it's like his relationship with reality is like super unclear, and he is sort of this like unfixed, almost like trickster figure kind of, and why. Yeah, I guess also like the choice of not just having him drown, but having him drown and then vanish, which obviously is like the central tension of the novel, is that one parent is like, he died, and one parent says, oh, he's missing, so he can still exist. Yeah. So I guess talk about like that decision of like it not just being death, but like that missing element, and then also this man who's sort of like at the center of this mystery.
I think it's part of my desire to create as much ambiguity around the cause of death for this boy, or the cause of loss, whether he's missing or not. I think having the possibility that he's been kidnapped requires that there be this figure, but also is, the high level contingency that this boy vanishes. I wanted to amp that up as much as possible, and partly by having it always be a question as to whether he is retrievable from somewhere and has been taken somewhere, but also whether he was harmed intentionally by not just the world, right? Gravity, waves, water, weather, but whether he was harmed by a person, right? And so, because I think the way that we deal with grief very often is by jumping to questions of causality, agency, why did this have to happen? Who is to blame for this? There's a lot of guilt and accusation that circulates in the family around this, and I wanted to intensify that as much as possible, because I wanted, in some ways, by making you sort of jump around the loss and wonder this, that, and the other about it, to show how futile that is. Because at the end of the day, as Wayne's father says, it doesn't matter. He's gone, right? And the goneness is actually what's important.
Yeah. Structurally speaking, the rotating first person POV with this like very dramatic sort of tonal and voice shift, can you talk about that decision, I don't want to like give away too much of the book, but I'm like I'm trying to decide how much I want to say. But I do find I was really fascinated by the leaving of C's voice, which is so sort of recursive and caught in this like almost like undertow of grief and loss, and it's like totally different voice that exists for this other character in the book. I guess just talk about like that choice and I guess that writing process also.
So we follow C and her family through the first half of the novel, and these losses, these iterations of loss, are accompanied by iterations of what I call reunions, where she meets a man who is, an older, brown, sort of resembles who her brother might have been had he survived. And at a very key moment in their interaction says his name is Wayne. And her mother believes that, that her son did not, in fact, die and is out there in the world somewhere. Cassandra is very committed to the idea that she felt him die, she saw him die. And then a man appears who has her brother's name and who looks a lot like her brother, and she feels this kind of familiarity and, as I said earlier, this kind of disturbing element of erotic longing. But right when she supposedly recognizes him, the world erupts around them. And so this was trying to stage what for me was one of the particularities of my mourning process in those who I've lost, which is of dreaming that the person who died is still alive. They're just on a vacation somewhere. And that the epigraph from Proust says as much. We don't really believe that someone is gone. We just think, oh yeah, they went on a trip. And I would I would reunite with my lost one in my dream, and then I would wake up, and it was like they died all over again. It was as disastrous and catastrophic as a building blowing up, which is how I enacted in the book. At some point, I realized that this kind of structure of melancholy, as I think Freud would put it, as repetition compulsion, was could not actually move forward because we were with Cassandra. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, well, I need there to be some forward motion. I need a plot of some kind for people to read this book. And in fact, that's actually why I chose the second half of the novel to be at first was noir. And it still has elements of crime fiction, because I was like, that will hold me to making a plot. And I knew at some point, I remember very vividly waking up one morning in my apartment in Berkeley and looking at this shadowy patch on the wall, and I was like, oh, it's going to be from the man that she keeps meeting's perspective. That's who we're going to turn to, and we're going to find out why he sought her out, because he clearly has sought her out. And so the second half of the novel follows that Wayne as we learn about his past and his history, but also his relationship to mourning and grief, which is very different from hers because they come from very different class positions. So he's lost his parents. He's an orphan. And that is almost like an obverse of what Cassandra and her family are going through in losing a child.
The things I've done to trick myself into writing plot. I feel like that's the realist. It is such a real situation where I'm like, how can I make myself do this? The one thing I refuse to do. Right. It's super real. So, most reviews of the novel have talked about the novel, the elegy, in the context of the loss of your sister, which you have written about somewhat. And you and I have had extremely long, passionate conversations on this subject of sort of the role of real life in fiction and the relationship between either other people's lives or the writer's own life. So I just wanted to talk to you, I just wanted to have that conversation again in front of all these lovely people that we've had so many times. Just talk about what does it mean to transmute our emotions, the things that we go through, things that other people go through, into fiction specifically?
Yeah, and it's a very interesting idea that we resort to, that we still take recourse to or fall back on. And I find it amazing that when you look at the long history of interviews with writers, or conversations, or recorded readings, letters they receive, the impulse to ask the writer, is this based on something that happened to you, is so intense that sometimes it goes to outlandish ideas. So I had an Italian man write to me recently to ask if the Italian family that in The Old Drift, my first novel, which is based on the names of his family that I read about in history books, and he said, well, this is my great aunt Lena. I feel like you really misrepresent her. And I was like, I didn't know her, and there was no information about this woman. Like, do you want me? I could change her name because it obviously feels like I've traduced something, I've betrayed something for you. But what was amazing to me was that he thought that it was a realist depiction when this woman's niece has hair growing out of her body continuously, like all the time, like it's magical realism. So it's like the idea that I could be accused of stealing someone's life when I'm writing something so very obviously fictional is wild to me. But it's like, even, I talk about this in this profile that recently came out, that even my mother, when she read The Furrows, because Cassandra has this real kind of error in logic and this kind of perversion of longing that leads her to essentially sleep with a man that she thinks is her brother, my mom was like, do you have incestuous feelings for your brother? I was like, oh my God. But it's one of those things where I realized in the profile that I did, I was like telling that story of my mom asking this question actually just begs the question more. I think it's like wearing a t-shirt that's like, I don't have feelings. It's like you can't escape it. But I'm like, if even my mother couldn't understand, knowing me and knowing my life and knowing everything about me, would think that something I wrote in a novel must be based on something real that I had experienced or felt. It means that you kind of have to constantly confront this now. I feel like I was saying to you earlier that I'm co-teaching a class right now with Professor Carpio, who is here in the audience, and some other professors. And one of the lectures was on Oedipus by Luke Menand, and who was my former advisor. And he was explaining mimesis, the concept of mimesis to the students. So Aristotle comes up with this theory of why we make art, why we represent things at all. And mimesis obviously related to the mimetic or imitation. So we're imitating what's in the world. And he told this like little anecdote, and it struck me so much. He said, you'll be hanging out with someone and they'll say, I took this amazing selfie the other day. Do you want to see it? And of course you want to see it, even though you're with the person. Like, why would you want to look at a photograph of a person that you're with? And so I think one of the fundamental questions, because we all know this impulse, we all love the imitation, is do we want to see the selfie because we're interested in something that is like life? Is it because we care about the real? Or is it because we care about the imitation? We care about the mediated thing. And that, I think, is undecidable. So I think some people, when they read fiction, want to read about life. They want to know about the truth. Other people want to read something that transmutes or transforms the truth into something else, something. To me, what I find really compelling about fiction is that it allows me to experience things, and not necessarily the same things I would experience in life, but something else has been constructed for me to experience. So my interest is always in the mediation, not in the real that it comes from. And my deepest interest as a writer is, how do you transform what we all know into something that is a fiction?
I also feel like a piece of this conversation is like that what we do is so mysterious. Like, but it truly is, right? I mean, I feel like when you really like break down like what it means to write fiction, and when people ask you like, how do you write a story, or like, where do your ideas come from? Like, I feel like it's like explaining your dreams. Like, it's just like, I don't know, like, I get like I see something, and then I sit down and I write, you know, or like I just hallucinate vividly for a while.
Right,
like,
yeah.
like, you know, yeah. So then I have another question for you,
Yeah.
which is, so as much as I dread bringing this into the conversation, but like autofiction as a concept, which I feel like I actually, having read so much about it, still do not fully understand. Like I actually had someone, I was showing somebody a news story the other day and they were like talking about its autofictional gestures. And I was like, what does that mean? Because I write about my life all the time in my fiction, like it's very frequently. And is just merely the act of putting something on the page a kind of mediation? Do you know what I mean? Like is even just the gesture of like transforming it from just something happening in life to putting it down somewhere.
Yeah, I think it's a spectrum of mediation, right? Because the language is a mediation already.
Right.
We're already betraying. I mean, in fact, I just remembered someone tweeted, and I just remembered this lovely line from a Bob Haas poem. A word is elegy for what it signifies. So even the word is somehow, removing us from the experience. I think this. Wait, what was your question?
Autofiction.
Autofiction. It's not shocking that I would immediately erase the word. I think I think the autofictional gesture is putting your name in the text. For example, like your narrator has your name. I think having, I'm mixed race, and so people assume that I'm Cassandra because Cassandra's mixed race. Someone asked me on the radio whether the relationship between Cassandra and her white mother is based on my relationship with my mother, and I was like, no, my mother wasn't a white artist from like California. My mother's a black Zambian but because we're both mixed race, we somehow I must be writing the same thing. And I was like, it's interesting because what I'm starting to realize is that there will be assumptions about who I am based on this character, surely because of this discourse. But like Cassandra goes for a lot of therapy, and I have not gone to very much therapy, for example. So there are things like this where I feel like there's there are ways that I could have made it more autofictional. I set part of it in Baltimore, and I grew up in Baltimore for some time, so there's that. I could have had her go to the universities that I go to, or become a professor, or what have you. So I think it's like when the narrator maps themselves so exactly onto the character that's considered autofiction. But I actually think that's a way of playing. You can actually just play with that. And there's a lot of writers that have long played with. Kafka has characters named K. Writers have been doing this for a very, very long time. Dante put all his worst enemies in Inferno. Like literal people that he knew, next to Virgil. So it's like this is not something that is so new to now, but I actually think it's the way we interpret it, or the focus that we have on pinpointing exactly what is real that has been put into the fiction, and then this question of the ethics of that, right? Do people have a patent on their lives, and are you somehow doing some kind of copyright infringement if you write about them? So people are very focused on that aspect of it right now. I think most writers are much more interested in the disparity between the thing itself and what you're writing on the page. Even when you're being a realist fiction. Jane Austen never got married, guys. You know what I mean? Like, they're interested in exploring things that we are interested in exploring things that didn't happen to us, or that could have happened differently.
Do we want to talk about the ethics question, or is that?
I'm happy to, because I think I have, as you said, also written nonfiction. I wrote an essay about my sister called Beauty Tips for My Dead Sister, that is highly mediated in that it's a set of instructions about how to, put mascara on, or how to stand when you're taking the photograph, but also like how to treat, the dead, because she died. And so it's from her perspective, it's, she's telling me what to do, and it's all in the second person. So it's highly mediated. There are details in there that are very much things that she taught me, that she did tell me, and I didn't make anything up. But in my revision process, ended up deleting a lot of things that pertained to other people, because it felt to me like all I could claim ownership of is my relationship to her and things that she said to me. I couldn't actually claim a relation to my father's feelings about losing my sister, or my mother's feelings, or my other sister's feelings. And even if I witnessed them, because early versions of the story I witnessed their responses, but I felt very much like I don't have a claim on that. And yet my father was still furious with me. You know, so it's like you try your best, you know, to just focus on the thing that is for you, or is about you, or what happened to you. But people will always read themselves into what you write, no matter what. So I think you gotta negotiate that, not in a legalistic fashion. We both have reason to think that that's a poor way of thinking about it, but in the way that we feel that there's an ethics of secret keeping. My best friend here, and I'm like constantly blowing up her spot, as she puts it, because I'll just like tell her a secret. She's like, "What are you doing?" It's just like information. It's like I'm a gossip, you know, because I love gossip. But it's like, yeah, some people have different relationships to discretion. My partner was like, "Maybe let's not put my name in the New York Times." I was like, "But I don't see why." But it's like everybody has, and we understand that that's an ethical question. So why wouldn't we? Why would we think it's different when we're writing fiction? That art justifies it? Doesn't it? Like, I mean, this part of the thing is like, is the story that good? Is it so specific that you can't change it enough? You know?
I feel like we also, the other day, after like many hours of talking about this, were like, but is the thing good? Like that was, we were like, isn't that really what it matters? And now the rest of it doesn't really, you know. So we are now taking questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and I'll be repeating it for the live stream. So, does anyone have any?
I know there's people in this room who I've represented in prose, so if you want to...
Oh yeah, if you want to weigh in on Namwali's representation of you also, please do.
Or you can ask about the novel.
Yes.
You sort of gestured to this early on about your relationship to genre, and I've read The Old Drift, and I was really excited by all the sort of like generic turns in it, and I'd just love to hear a little bit more about your process and your way into thinking through all these different kinds of genre, like science fiction, magical realism, the elegy, the noir too. Like, I'd just love to hear a bit more about your relationship to those different genres.
So the question is your relationship with the various genres that you have written about in your novels.
Thank you for that question. I've been trying to figure out whence my eclecticism when it comes to genre, and I think it comes from being an untutored reader. The kind of, when I first came to the U.S. as an 8.5-year-old, I was put into a reading program in 5th grade, and we read the Tripod trilogy. And that was my first real exposure to science fiction. And I didn't have a real sense that certain genres were privileged over others. I was reading so much at that time because I was really lonely. I had no friends, so I would go to the library, that I would read, you know, Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys and, you know, Judy Blume and all these different, Rich Terabithia was one of my favorite books. And I read all of these books, and I just didn't understand that I was supposed to think some of them were great literature and some of them were not. When I got to college, it was like, okay, now you're only allowed to read like Milton and all these people. But then in reading them, I noticed that they were using genres, not Milton per se, but reading Lolita, for example, the second half of Lolita is very influenced by noir. And it's sort of like when you follow the footnotes in an essay where you're like, oh, I want to know where this came from, and you read the other. I was like following the genres in some of these literary texts. And so following Lolita back to Poe, and following, you know, Lolita back to Raymond Chandler and noir, and figuring out all these other genres that I hadn't really experienced before. It seems to me that we think about genre in very bounded terms. Like, there was just a recent debate about science fiction versus fantasy, and I don't think that writers think in that way, and especially the first writers who came up with these genres or started working these genres. I'm teaching Frankenstein in a couple of weeks, and it's like, I don't think Mary Shelley was like, is it horror or is it sci-fi? She was like, she wanted to write about a creature, and she had all these really interesting ideas about, galvanizing bodies, and it was also really creepy, and she was also mourning, right, because she had lost her kid, and she had just been pregnant, so it's like all of these really, really fascinating things are kind of mashed up together and produce this very particular tone and atmosphere, and then these become tropes that we now as writers are trying to imitate. But for me, it felt with the Old Drift very natural that certain characters came to me in different genres. They just came to me in science fiction, or they came to me in magical realism. And then I had to figure out how to construct their story. And only after I had started the novel did I start to read Angela Carter. I read more Salman Rushdie, but Jennifer Egan's Visit from the Goon Squad came out later, and Cloud Atlas, which was incredibly influential, came out after I had already started the novel. And I thought, oh, there's other people interested in doing what I'm doing. And that gave me the confidence to really dive deep and work through them. My interest in using genre as an artist, not just as a reader, is I think that genre is a lens on the world, and the lenses they refract the world differently. You have different paradigms of causality, of human motivation, of psychology, that all become available to you when you are working in a particular genre. And that, I think, is very, it's just more, I wouldn't even call it tools, I would say it's just more for you to work with as an artist.
Anyone else? Yeah.
Well, do you, I'm glad you talked a lot about do you struggle, does it feel like badly to have to defend yourself for writing what you want to write, both of you, under your own names? Under my own name, saying what I want to say. Some of it is oneself, or it's not oneself, it's fiction if you wish, but it's still very, very brave. How do you have the courage?
So the question is having the courage to write about what we write about under our own identities.
I mean, I really have wanted many times to Ferrante it as a
Of course, we would never meet you.
It's true. But I mean, sometimes I get so frustrated because everybody wants to be cute. Everybody wants to look good. But I chose a career that is me in a room alone with my words, and that I have to do photography shoots is horrible. And to me, I'm like, why? But it's like, oh, it helps sell the books. Does it? Or is it just like more stuff for like people to do? Like for it's like magazines and all this stuff. So I sometimes feel like I wish I hadn't. But I think. I mean, bravery is a really good way to put it, but I don't think I feel brave when I'm writing. It doesn't seem like it's a choice to me. I feel incredibly privileged to finally be allowed to do the thing that I've always wanted to do, which is, as you said, like hallucinate on page for hours at a time, and then have people. It's an immense privilege for people to want to publish it and then want to read it. That's a beautiful thing, but it doesn't feel like I had a choice in the matter. I tried to stop writing once. I got very negative feedback. I'm like looking around. I'm like, there's like 7 people here who know exactly what I'm talking about. I got very negative feedback from someone I respected immensely, and I decided to stop writing. I was like, this is not worth it. And I was 23 or so. And I was walking down the street one day, and I was like, I'm just moving on, and I was like, oh wow, there's a woman is crouching there under that bush. I should help her. And then I was like, oh, that's not a woman crouching under a bush, that's a shadow. Kept walking. And I was still thinking about the woman. And I was like making a story about why she was crouching under the bush. And I was like, I just do this. This is what my brain does. And so I may as well write it down. But for a long time, I still didn't send things out for publication because I thought, well, I've been told that what I'm doing is not something other people want to read. And so I think the bravery for me was not about writing or even putting my name to it. It was about trying to actually publish it. And that's a different quest, I think. And I don't know how you feel about that.
Well, yeah, the word bravery is also really interesting to me. I mean, I'm just thinking about how, again, it is immense privilege, but I do think that, and I feel bad your publicist is in this room right now, but I feel the infrastructure around publishing a book, the stuff, is exhausting, right? And I think, there is something like really specific about having done the thing, and it does make one be like, I know you understand, like, the writers become hermits, like, they publish a single book and then they, like, never give interviews and they, like, live, no one can find them and they just, like, never talk about it. Yeah, right, exactly, right. And so one just feels sympathetic to that. But yeah, I don't know. But I also feel like, again, the same thing about how it's also just like an impulse and an instinct and I don't really know what else I would do with it. Even if sometimes it is kind of terrifying in its own way, but.
Well, thank you, because I came here, I really wanted to ask you this question.
I mean, we all want to be immortal, So this is our version. You put your name to the thing and you leave it behind, and that's the best you can do.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else? Oh, are we good?
Well, I have a question.
Oh, you have a question? Oh, please, yes, of course.
Yeah, well, I'm curious because this is not your first book, and I'm sure much of it was written or worked on or edited during the pandemic, which we're still in. And I'm wondering what about this book and either the publishing of it or the writing of it that surprised you or felt different or new than previous books you'd worked on?
So the order of my books is a funny problem. So I actually wrote the first full draft of this book between 2008 and 2014, and then put it in a drawer, and went back to it after publishing The Old Drift, and which I had started, in 2001 and worked on, and then put aside for a long time, and then finished in a very. It's like that, last minute all-nighter you pull, but like for 2 years to meet my deadline from my publisher. And so which one came first is it's a funny question. But in the revision, I would say, which I started revising the book in December of 2019.